5 African women changing the world silently. While the world keeps its eyes fixed on Ibrahim Traoré, the young face of Africa's bold defiance against Western dominance, something far from the cameras is quietly unfolding. Not with weapons, not with speeches, but with patience, with care, with the kind of quiet actions that wear down even the strongest walls like water on stone. In dusty clinics, village halls, and mud brick classrooms filled with hope, a different kind of revolution is rising. They call it the Silent Uprising. A quiet wave not led by generals or presidents, but by women. Just 5 of them. Ordinary names until you learn what they've done. They didn't fire a single bullet, but they shattered something older and stronger than any army. The belief that power belongs only to men. What you're about to hear is a fictional account. A dream, perhaps, but one inspired by real women. Women who are already changing Africa quietly, one day at a time. And tonight we invite you to step into their story. There's a small village nestled deep in the Sahel, where the wind carries sand like ghosts across the plains, and the sound of evening drums is the only sign that life still stirs. People used to say, where nothing grows, not even hope can take root. But they were wrong. The first spark in this silent uprising was a woman named Mariam Diarra. She wasn't an activist, not a politician, just a village nurse who lived in a thatched hut and taught the children to read after her long days at the tiny health post. Mariam had seen things city dwellers could barely imagine. Babies born in dust storms, childbirths under moonlight, mothers losing children, because a simple antibiotic was nowhere to be found. But somewhere between the heartbreak and the silence, she began to see something else possibility. One day, after losing a young mother to postpartum bleeding, Mariam didn't return to her clinic as usual. She walked straight to the village chief's home, an elder known for his strict old guard ways. She didn't ask. She demanded the right to form a women's council. They laughed. What do women know about leadership? Take care of your kitchen first, then worry about the village. Mariam didn't answer with words. She began teaching the women how to treat bleeding after birth, how to grow medicinal herbs, how to keep birth records in worn notebooks. Slowly, one by one, they left their pots and firewood behind to sit with her in a thatched tent filled with paper and hope. In just 3 years, maternal death rates in the village dropped by half. Children were fully vaccinated. The woman once ignored now stood in the village festivals giving speeches. And then something no one had seen in 50 years happened. For the first time, a woman was elected as an advisor on the village elder council. No one called it a revolution. But from that moment on, women began looking at Mariam differently. Not just a nurse, but a flame bearer. And fire, as you know, doesn't have to roar to burn down a rotten system. In the southern region of Côte d'Ivoire, where rubber trees stretch toward the horizon, like soldiers standing eternal watch, lies a village whose name never makes the maps. Each morning, mist clings to the milky bark of the trees, and the birds sing not for applause, but because they must. Among them stands a small, weathered schoolhouse. No electricity, no screens, no digital tools. Just a woman standing tall before her children with nothing but chalkbooks and a heart full of light. Her name is Nadine Kouadio. She was once the village's brightest hope. She passed the exams. She got the scholarship to a prestigious university in Abidjan. She even had an offer to study in France, but Nadine said no. Why turn down a chance to change your life? People asked. She only smiled, because I don't want to trade myself for someone else's life. She returned home with nothing but 3 suitcases full of worn books and a degree in education. Her first day teaching 7 students. One fell asleep from collecting firewood at dawn. Another came with bruises on her cheek from her father. One had never seen a real book, only the calendar pages on her wall. But Nadine didn't see pity. She saw untapped strength. She began with the basics, writing names with charcoal on wooden boards, washing hands before eating, sharing African folktales on quiet afternoons. Gradually, she wove in bigger lessons about dignity, about listening, about asking questions instead of blindly obeying. She knew transformation couldn't come from her alone. so she went door to door. She sat with illiterate mothers, not as a teacher, but as a friend. She launched Dream Week, where children could stand before the village and speak their dreams, whether it was to be a doctor, an artist, or even a joyful street cleaner. One silent little girl who hadn't spoken a word for a year stood up and whispered, "I want to be a teacher, like Miss Nadine." When the rain came, the roof leaked. She and the students caught drops with pots and kept reading beneath the storm. Some days, no one came to class because the fields called and labor came first. So Nadine walked to every house, knocking until nightfall, asking, "Can your child come to school tomorrow?" By year 5, the broken schoolhouse had become a village hub. Mothers no longer whispered about their daughter's menstruation with shame. Fathers began asking, "Was class fun today?" Tiny shifts, but Nadine knew each one was a seed sprouting beneath the soil. Then her story began to travel. She was invited to speak on local radio. Newspapers called her a symbol of education in marginalized communities. But when asked how she felt, she said simply, "I'm not changing the world. I'm just doing my job with my whole heart." If Mariam lit the match, Nadine tended the flame through wind and rain. And now that flame was reaching the next distant hill. In the capital city of Ouagadougou, where the streets are forever jammed with government convoys and sirens never seem to stop, there stands an aging building known only to insiders as the glass cage of power. Inside every document stamped with a red seal, every decision made has the power to shape the fate of millions. But few ever notice the woman who quietly walks into her office on the 3rd floor each morning, always on time, always alone, like a familiar shadow. Her name is Aïssata Diarra. She is not a minister, not a media face. She doesn't make loud speeches. But anyone who's worked long enough in the government knows one thing: Aïssata is the only person who dares to revise a law that all the men in the room nod to without even reading. Born into a middle-class family, she once dreamed of becoming a doctor. But everything changed the day she saw a woman denied health insurance simply because her husband's name wasn't listed on the paperwork. That day, Aïssata switched paths to study law. "I couldn't cure women's bodies," she said, "but I could mend the system that keeps hurting them." When she joined the Ministry of Social Development, it didn't take long for her to see the cracks. Policies written by people who had never lived like ordinary citizens. Girls dropped out of school because of menstruation, but the national health budget had no line for reproductive education. Widows were denied land inheritance due to traditional law. Women couldn't access loans unless their husbands co-signed. Aïssata didn't raise her voice. She quietly crossed out discriminatory clauses and rewrote them in the language of justice. She hosted small workshops teaching young female staffers how to read budgets, dissect policy, and perhaps most importantly, how to say no without trembling. One day during a meeting with over 40 male officials, a man smirked. "Is Aïssata planning to start a revolution again?" She responded without raising her tone. "I'm not starting a revolution. I'm fixing what you've ignored for decades." That sentence spread like a breeze through the halls. A week later, her office received transfer requests from 8 young women. Their message was clear. "We want to learn how to build policy like you." Aïssata still wears the same plain gray suit, still drives the same old car, still has no social media presence. But what she quietly does each day has helped thousands of women break free from the invisible chains that outdated laws once wrapped around their lives. If Mariam is the awakener, and Nadine the planter of seeds, then Aïssata is the one who tills the hardened soil of broken systems so that something new may finally grow. In northern Niger, where the red earth cracks under the sun and the desert wind scorches every tin roof, there lies a small village named Tamouré. It has no streetlights, no cell phone signal, and no paved roads. But the villagers speak with quiet pride about one thing: a tin-roofed school standing alone on the edge of the desert. The person who built that school is Nadine Diallo. She's not a politician. She never studied at Harvard or Oxford. She's never given a speech on television. Nadine is simply a primary school teacher who once walked over 6 kilometers a day, carrying a small blackboard and a few borrowed books just to teach children under a giant baobab tree. Born into a nomadic family, Nadine grew up moving with the seasons. Her mother gave birth to 8 children without ever setting foot in a hospital. Her father used to say, "Daughters are like sand, where the wind blows they go." But Nadine believed the opposite. Even sand can hold seeds if you know how to keep the water. At 19, she witnessed her 13-year-old sister being forced to marry a man 3 times her age. Nadine begged, pleaded, even cried. But her voice was drowned out by the sound of drums at the wedding. That day, she didn't attend. Instead, she walked to the commune office and asked for documents on child marriage laws. And from that moment, she set out on a path no one in her village had dared to take before teaching girls to think for themselves. At first, there were only 3 students, 1 blackboard, 1 piece of chalk. No desks, no books. Each morning, Nadine swept the sand, laid out a mat, and read from a tattered page. When it rained, she taught in an abandoned goat shed. When she was threatened, she showed up again the next day. One day, a father barged into the class and pulled his daughter away mid-lesson yelling, "You trying to turn our girls into rebels?" Nadine replied calmly and firmly, "I'm not teaching them to rebel. I'm teaching them they have choices." She didn't scream. She didn't protest. She simply wrote letters by hand to the provincial office requesting textbooks. After 3 rejections on her 4th try, she traveled 300 kilometers herself to ask in person. She returned with a sack of worn books strapped to the back of her bicycle. One day, a girl named Amina stopped coming to class. Nadine went to find her and learned she was being kept home prepared for marriage. That night, Nadine wrote a letter and slipped it into Amina's palm, teaching her how to request protection from the authorities. 3 months later, Amina escaped the marriage and returned to school. Today, Amina is a doctor at the provincial hospital. Fatou, who once couldn't read, is now studying solar energy engineering in Senegal. Nadine never called herself an activist. She only smiled and said, "I just plant seeds. Each one knows how to grow on its own." At a district meeting, an elderly male official once scoffed, "You think girls can be equal to boys?" Nadine looked him in the eye and said, "I don't think. I teach them to think." The school Nadine built now has a real roof, whiteboards, and a tiny library. No flashy banners, no cameras, but every girl who walks out of that classroom carries something new, the belief that she wasn't born just to be someone's wife, but to become someone who builds something real. In a small riverside town nestled between the twin arteries of Mali's great rivers, where the water rises and falls like the breath of the land, there lies a town called Mopti. At dusk, sailboats drift downstream carrying rice children's laughter and stories that never made it to paper. In a modest house near the water, a quiet woman lives with no official title, no social media presence. And yet, in the world of independent journalism and human rights in West Africa, she's a name whispered with deep respect. Her work always signed, simply, anonymous author. No one knows her face. No one truly knows where she lives. But her articles on domestic violence, corruption in local councils, and human trafficking have been cited by international organizations, reprinted by European media outlets, and quietly passed into the hands of lawmakers. Her real name is Fatimata Koné. Fatimata once dreamed of becoming a journalist. That dream crashed after she exposed a bribery scheme in her local government. Threatened, briefly detained, and eventually forced out of her job at the provincial radio station, she vanished from public view. But instead of retreating, she chose a different path, writing for the people, not for recognition. She wrote under aliases, submitting stories through dusty internet cafes using encrypted emails and code names. Her articles were short, but razor-sharp, cutting, cleanly exposing the lies. One piece told the story of a mother who lost her daughter to traffickers simply because she couldn't afford the bribe to report it. The story spread across WhatsApp, was translated into French, and eventually reached the United Nations. 3 months later, the local government launched an official investigation. Fatimata never claimed credit. She simply said, "I don't need people to know who I am. I just need someone to read and decide to stand up." One day, she received a handwritten letter from a rural girl. "I read your story and now I know I'm not alone." Fatimata wept. For the first time in years, her words felt like they were truly changing something. You don't need a microphone to make an impact. Some people only need a pen and a heart, unafraid to speak. And the lesson here: change doesn't always come through the gates of power. Sometimes it begins on unsigned sheets of paper from women who dare to write what others only dare to think. When Ibrahim Traoré read about her from a confidential briefing, he didn't try to censor her. He simply said to his advisor, "If a nation fears women like her, then it's not strong enough to survive." Fatimata Koné never needed to enter politics, but her silent ink strokes were part of the underground current now shaking a continent awake. In a quiet village nestled between red hills and windswept savannas of northern Ghana, people spoke of her not as a doctor, but as the one who listens. Her name was Dr. Selina Ayu, and she wasn't like the others. She didn't drive a black SUV with sirens. She didn't speak in medical jargon. She didn't wear her white coat like a badge of honor. Instead, she walked, through the dust, through the rain, from hut to hut, village to village, listening, touching, healing. Selina had studied medicine abroad, trained in Europe, and could have built a thriving career in Accra or even overseas. But something always pulled her back to the place where children still died from preventable fevers and mothers gave birth on bare floors under candlelight. She wasn't just treating bodies, she was healing systems. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she sat under a neem tree beside an elder woman whose daughter had died giving birth. The woman asked only one question. Why do our girls always have to bleed before someone listens? That question haunted Selina. She began documenting every maternal death in her district. Not just the medical cause, but the truth behind it. Lack of roads, no prenatal care. Husbands who decided if their wives could visit the clinic. She compiled a report, printed 50 copies with her own savings, and sent them to every regional official and news outlet she could find. At first, silence. Then, a whisper. A radio talk show discussed her report. A local NGO called. A female mayor invited her for tea. 3 months later, a mobile clinic was funded. 6 months later, male community leaders began attending maternal health workshops. Selina didn't plan a revolution. She simply refused to let women die in silence. The lesson: some change doesn't begin with a speech. It begins with a ledger, a quiet witness, and a doctor who chooses to write down what everyone else looks away from. When President Traoré heard about Selina's work during a UN development briefing, he reportedly paused, leaned forward, and said, "If every country had one woman like this, we'd need fewer parliaments and more listening posts." And that's the truth. Selina represented not just medicine, but dignity. Not just health, but visibility. In the dense jungles of Congo, where blank spots still linger on Google Maps, and the drumbeat still calls villagers at dawn, there lives a woman known simply as Mother Firekeeper. Her real name is Odette Mbenga, a former primary school teacher, now a symbol of hope in a land once scorched by war. Odette lost 2 younger brothers in the same rainy season, victims of stray bullets. Her family shattered, her village burned to the ground. When peace tentatively returned, most people fled. But Odette came back. She had no weapons, no money, only one unshakable belief that children could still learn to read even under the trees. She began with a hand-painted chalkboard set up beneath the forest edge. Every morning she beat the drum. At first, only 3 children came. One had no shoes. One feared grown-ups. One didn't know how to hold a pen. But she was patient. Each week, a few more came. Each month, more families dared to return and plant again. She taught the alphabet, but really she was teaching something greater, a belief that tomorrow could still be beautiful. One day, when an international aid team came to assess the area for rebuilding schools, they asked, "Is there anyone here with teaching experience?" A small child raised their hand and pointed at her. "She's the one who taught us to believe in ourselves." They built a real school. But what made it different was Odette's spirit. No forced uniforms, no corporal punishment, no rigid barrier between teacher and student, only the language of respect. And what's the lesson here? When a community has lost everything, the first thing they need isn't bricks, it's someone brave enough to light the fire again. Not a fire of spectacle, but a quiet flame that refuses to die in the ashes. When President Traoré later launched the Rooted Recovery Initiative for neglected communities, he quoted Odette in his speech, "If you want to rebuild a village, don't start with houses. Start with children." And when that woman who had risen from the ruins stood before hundreds of national leaders, she simply smiled. A smile the forest still remembers. In a dry region between Niger and Burkina Faso, where the edges of national maps blur into nameless dust trails, lived a man named Issoufou Maïga. He wasn't an engineer or a government surveyor, yet the villagers affectionately called him the walking mapmaker. Issoufou was born in a village that didn't exist on any official map. As a child, whenever officials from the capital came to distribute aid or launch a new project, he would hear the same dismissive line, "This village isn't on the list." So the villagers were left out not because they didn't exist, but because they didn't exist in the system. When he grew up, Issoufou set out to change that. He taught himself to draw maps first by hand on scrap paper, then using a smartphone and free GPS apps. He walked from village to village, asking the names of every stream, every unnamed road, every forgotten rice field. Once an old man chuckled and told him, "You're drawing all that, but no one will ever use it, son." Issoufou scratched his head and replied, "No one's used it? Because no one ever had it." He kept going for 3 long years. Eventually, with support from an international NGO, his map was recognized officially. At a national conference in Ouagadougou, he was invited to speak. One sentence silenced the entire room. "If you're not on the map, you're not in the budget." And he was right. After that map, his village finally got its first preschool, a cell tower, and a red dirt road. Nothing fancy, but it was there. What's the small lesson here? In a world increasingly dependent on data and digital systems, some people quietly write their communities into existence so they're no longer invisible. Issoufou didn't ask for money or fame. All he hoped for was that a child born in a nameless village knows the ground they stand on is more than just a forgotten dot. And if Issoufou drew his maps with love, then you, the one hearing this story, have the power to chart new futures simply by sharing these forgotten maps. But what if maps weren't only made with GPS, but with language and belief? Let's now meet a woman who wrote the blueprint of tomorrow using only the words she carried, though she herself never made it through primary school. In a small southern village of Burkina Faso, there lived a woman named Mariam Diarra. She had never made it past the 2nd grade. She couldn't read, couldn't write, and didn't even have an official ID. Yet every evening the villagers gathered at her thatched roof home as if it were a school with no chalkboard, no notebooks, just her presence. The reason was simple: she knew how to listen. One year, a harsh drought devastated the harvest. Aid organizations arrived with food, but due to missing records, poor documentation, and a lack of formal advocacy, almost no one received help. Officials stared at cold Excel spreadsheets and turned away. Mariam didn't understand spreadsheets, but she understood the despair in a mother's eyes as she rocked a starving child. So every night she walked door to door asking, "How many people live here? How much rice is left? Who is sick?" She remembered everything. No notes, no paper. The next morning, she approached the village chief, the commune officer, and translated everything into a language the aid workers could understand: data names, numbers, needs, and proposals. Her son helped write it all down. Those papers, one after another, got over 300 villagers included on official relief lists. People were stunned. "You did all that without knowing how to read," she smiled. "Knowing letters isn't the same as knowing people. And I know every soul in this village." Since then, they called her the woman who reads with her heart. She held no official title, no formal power, but she became the pulse of her village, linking stories, needs, and names from elderly people left without pensions to school kids who needed help traveling to town. And what's the lesson here? Sometimes the system runs on bureaucracy and tech, but communities run on memory and compassion, often from the ones no one notices. People without titles, who quietly become lanterns in the dark. And just like Mariam in another countryside far away, there's a mute tailor who has sewn every single flag for dozens of grassroots women's movements without ever saying a single word. She's the one you'll meet in the next part. For months, the whispers had been growing not just in the capital, but in the fields, the markets, the classrooms, and the churches. People weren't just asking for better policies anymore. They were asking softly but steadily for something deeper: dignity. Then, one day, in a village known more for its clay ovens than for its council meetings, a group of local women gathered. They weren't famous, they didn't wear uniforms, and they certainly didn't call themselves politicians. But they had seen enough. Enough of their children walking miles for water. Enough of their husbands returning defeated from city jobs that vanished like smoke. Enough of being talked over. With worn notebooks and borrowed pens, they began drafting what they called a charter of care. It wasn't just demands, it was a declaration of a new kind of leadership, one rooted not in control, but in compassion. A local radio station picked it up. Then a teacher translated it. Then a journalist in the city reprinted it. Within a week, 1,000 copies had reached corners of the country that no law had ever touched. Something had changed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't televised, but it was real. And when Ibrahim Traoré, recovering from one of the most dramatic years of his presidency, read the document in his office, he didn't see it as a threat. He saw it as a mirror. A nation led only from the top, he said, is a house with no foundation. But this is the ground rising to meet the roof. He paused, then smiled. Let it rise. And so, a new chapter began. Not written by generals or presidents, but by seamstresses, teachers, midwives, and quiet women in gray suits. The revolution didn't roar, it hummed. And for the first time in a long time, people across Burkina Faso and beyond leaned in to listen. Some uprisings make no noise, no gunfire, just pens moving, hearts stirring, and hands that never stop working. 10 women, 10 stories, but one shared longing to build a fairer, kinder Africa, not just for men, but for everyone. If you believe that change doesn't have to be loud to be powerful, if you see yourself reflected in any of these stories, leave a single dot in the comments. Let us know you're still listening, still here, still part of a quiet revolution. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell, not because this channel needs you, but because someday you might need stories like these to remember there is still hope.